Okay, welcome everybody. Another episode of Junior Resource Investing. As always, before we get going, please note all standard disclaimers apply. Blue sky discussions, forward-looking statements. This is going to be a conversation with a lot of moving parts here, so I just want to make sure that we're all aware of those things as always. Martin Turenne, President and CEO of FPX Nickel, is joining me today, though. They have a PFS out on their Baptiste project in the Dakar Nickel District in central British Columbia. Some big news out today. I had the thought, and I kind of let Martin know that this is going to be maybe my MO for this talk. But FPX is already a fairly well-known company at this point, and so I thought there was value in maybe not spending too much time going through sort of those more rote discussions that slide decks can answer for people, and maybe just kind of get into more of a tailored conversation for investors, by investors. And we were talking, I was kind of fishing for some questions from CEO.ca, and your followers were quite happy to oblige me. So no, I guess, Martin, thank you for joining me. And I think maybe, why don't we just get started by, having said that, why don't you give us just for kind of the contextualizing, framing part of this conversation, take 2 or 3 minutes and pitch us FPX. It'll help us kind of fill in the blanks on what your company is.
Yeah, happy to do that. And thanks for having us on, Matt. So yeah, I'm Martin Turenne, President and CEO of FPX Nickel. We're based in Vancouver. Just quickly on myself, I've been with the company for over 11 years now, the last 8 of which as the CEO of the company. Over that time, we've moved the project, our main Baptiste project, which is really the focus of the company, from exploration through a PEA, and more recently through the delivery of a PFS, or preliminary feasibility study, in September of 2023. The project at a high level is one of the world's largest undeveloped nickel deposits, and the PFS really crystallizes that it has a very simple, robust flow sheet to produce a very high value product with low cost within the bottom quartile of the cost curve, with a low associated carbon footprint, and the unique ability to produce a product that doesn't need to go through smelting, and therefore allows us to access end markets more quickly in the stainless steel and the EV battery supply chains. And by cutting out that smelting step, we can get paid a lot more for the nickel in our concentrate versus other peers developing nickel sulfide concentrate projects. We've recently taken on, strategic investment over the last year and a half from 3 different large, well-known groups, and most recently from Sumitomo Metal Mining, which is one of the largest nickel producers in the world. So the company is well positioned with a strong asset, right place, right jurisdiction, and now with the right strategic backing as well.
Yeah, excellent. And I immediately already want to go off script and want you to discuss philosophically 2-tiered pricing and carbon and pricing carbon. I think I'll withhold from that, because I think it makes sense for us to, because this is spurred by some big news today. As you say, a new partnership announced. Sumitomo, do you mind can you just introduce that news a bit more for us again, to help? I'm going to be discussing your various partnerships here next, and just to help us kind of frame the conversation, do you want to introduce us to the news you had out today?
Yeah, so earlier today we announced an equity investment from Sumitomo Metal Mining. They will, on closing of the financing, own 9.9% of FPX. That financing is being priced at 48 cents a share. That's at a time when our volume weighted average price was about 28 cents a share over the last 20 trading days. So the offering price represents a very significant 72% premium to our share price prior to the announcement. That's just very uncommon to see that. As a market participant, I'm sure you can recognize that this sort of thing, financings at this significant a premium just do not occur in this space very often, particularly in these relatively challenging markets. Now, who is Sumitomo? They're Japan's largest mining and metal processing company, about a $10 billion company. Very long experience. They've literally been around for hundreds of years. Mining and processing and refining metal products for the Japanese economy. Very well-regarded mine operators, and also processors and marketers of nickel products in particular, both in the stainless and the EV battery markets. They're well known as sort of a partner of choice for some of the tier 1 mining companies out there, like Freeport-McMoRan and Teck. So they're an ideal minority interest partner in a project as well, particularly as projects move towards the project finance and construction and operation phase. Really, their entire MO is to go out and secure raw materials, sell those into the Japanese economy for Japanese industrial use. And it's part of really an integrated strategy within the Japanese economy to secure raw materials. And their investment here is novel for them. In this cycle, they haven't invested in other nickel companies or nickel projects. So the fact that they've chosen us here to put their money in is a real vote of confidence for the management and for the viability of the project, both from a technical standpoint and economic standpoint, and also with respect to the permittability of the project ultimately as well.
I'm going to kind of go more kind of 30,000 foot scale here, but I can't help but kind of drill down into the specifics. And I find it so interesting. I think it's so symptomatic of the unhealthy market, particularly for developer companies such as your own DevCos, where, you $14.4 million for 9.9% of the company. That seems like a pretty clear flag to be planted in the ground for evaluation. Strikes me in a healthier environment, you might see a re-rate to that, to something approximating that value. Instead, it seems there's just that frustrating kind of stuck in the mud sort of situation. But unless you want to touch on that, and you feel free to respond. But the question I have, I wanted to maybe just discuss Sumitomo a bit. And how long was this deal in the works? I guess, if now that it's done, maybe you can lift the veil a bit and kind of just how long were you in discussions with these guys? How many iterations of conversations were there? Can you kind of provide some color on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I've known various individuals and met with individuals within SMM or Sumitomo Metal Mining for many years now, going back many, many years. But this most recent, this investment and this recent volley of activity really started around September of last year. They approached us. They had identified ours as a project of interest. That kicked off a due diligence process that kind of culminated in the investment today. I think it's fair to say that many different Japanese players are, let's say, more motivated now than they would have been even 12 months ago to go out and secure raw materials for Japanese industry, specifically through the EV lens. And so it's become apparent to us in our discussions with multiple Japanese players that there's been a real tone change. 5-6 years ago, and when I was first getting to know some people within SMM, it was not a bullish view on nickel. There was not a bullish view on outbound investment. Commodity prices were low, and we were just at a point in the cycle when companies like that were almost in most cases looking to divest assets and not actually looking to add new investments into the portfolio. That has very much changed. We're not the only nickel company that has seen that recently. And it's good to see that we're entering a part of the cycle now where you've seen these toehold investments. And to me, ultimately, these toehold investments are the ultimate indicator and precursor to M&A in the space as well. That's just the way that these cycles typically kick off. And so I think people should absolutely be taking note of that as a theme generally. And obviously that's important for FPX specifically too.
I think that's interesting. I think that, retail can't help, and of course everybody does. The spot price can't help but focus on spot price these days. Of course, it's quite low, right? And on the flip side of that, you get these strategics, these multinationals, these very large organizations who are much more forward thinking, making very large waves in the space. As you say, there's been a couple of deals recently, right? Just kind of pursuing that previous line of questioning. I mean, how much back and forth was there? Was this a pretty easy debate, discussion, or negotiation where it was largely kind of agreed upon early on, or was there a little bit of back and forth going on and negotiation and a little bit of hardball here and there? Or how did that kind of transpire?
Like any of the discussion or negotiation around a transaction like this, there's always going to be back and forth, right? Both sides start off wanting the moon, and the art of business is the art of compromise. That's absolutely the case here. I know I'm being a bit generic in my comments. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on how it all came together. I would say that we did see interest from other groups in parallel, which helped us to ensure that we were driving a strong sort of outcome for our shareholders and for the future of the company. And SMM was far from the only group interested in making an investment here, which is obviously helpful from our standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just another transition here, and maybe allows you to speak more freely, speaking about your own perspective versus in trying to intimate someone else's perspective. But to me, the devil is in the details for these sort of deals, right? And that one offtake agreement, not all agreements are the same, right? And that I am consistently impressed. I kind of scanned through in preparation for this interview. You've got these 3 or 4 deals over the past 6 or 12 months, and I'm impressed by the sort of clauses that you managed to input into these that kind of materially strengthen the position of FPX, right? I'm talking about yearly limits on offtake agreements versus life of mine sort of things that you have with Outokumpu, right? Can you, maybe this is kind of a philosophical question, I guess, right? I mean, when you enter these negotiations, I mean, what are your priorities? What do you have in the front of your mind, or what do you keep in the front of your mind, or what is the approach that you bring that manages to affect these sort of positive outcomes pretty consistently for FPX?
Well, first of all, it's just the truth that our asset is a fantastic asset. Simple as that. That's what helps us to set the tone that allows us to get strong deals done on behalf of the company and on behalf of shareholders. That's really where it begins. The stronger the asset you have, the better the deal that you can negotiate. If I just step back for a second here, what's been interesting to me in this sector and the battery metal space over the last few years is you're seeing clearly that the pool of investors and partners has broadened quite a bit for companies like ours. Going back 3, 4, 5 years ago, the only real strategic partners for a project like this would have been, a major mining company. Now it's major mining companies, but it's also stainless steel companies, and it's battery companies, and it's chemical companies, and it's the automakers themselves. And so understanding that there's a much broader pool of potential sources of capital obviously then puts us in an even better position from a negotiation standpoint. Now, we have seen other companies in nickel and in things like lithium in recent months and in years gone by do deals where they are dealing with downstream off-taker types and they're giving away off-take to their project on a life of mine basis, or they're giving away off-take on a life of mine basis, and they're selling they're forward selling that product at a discount to market. I mean, some of the deals that have been done have been absolutely outrageous. And really, really bad in terms of the interests of the junior mining company in question. And oftentimes, those deals have been done without any injection of capital up front by that off-taker. So we always say that offtake is like the firstborn child of a mining project, and that cannot be given away easily. That's the mentality that we take in all these negotiations. We make that point very clear to those counterparties, and by and large, they recognize that, and I think the terms we're able to extract from them in these agreements testifies again, one, to asset quality, and just to the unique position we have in having a wide pool of potentially of interested groups and being able to drive the best possible deal as a result of that.
And I'm going to bounce a bit here. I want to talk about Jogmec and try to get some updates from other partnerships there. But I think I have a question here just around transitioning into more of an M&A sort of conversation here, right? And so how do you balance bringing strategics in and selling ownership positions and offtakes, which obviously serve to legitimize and progress your project in a meaningful and material way, but you still leave that enough meat on the bone, so to speak, to entice a buyout or to find that buyer who might not want to be encumbered by those hangers-ons, right? What's the sweet spot? How do you balance these kind of two divergent pressures?
Yeah, it is a balancing act for sure for any company, because that offtake interest is something that can provide capital, but it does come with a cost in that you are sort of selling off your firstborn to some extent. Now, in the case of both the Outokumpu and the Sumitomo investment, we haven't actually negotiated offtake as such, but we've simply granted rights to those two groups to negotiate offtake with us or with the project operator at a later date, whoever that operator may be. And the implication there is that those negotiations will happen completely on market terms. There'll be no discussion of pricing discounts or anything else like that. And in addition to that, between the two of those groups, we've given rights to approximately 120,000 tons of nickel over the life of mine. That's versus that represents collectively about 7% of the life of mine production. That leaves 93% or so of the life of mine nickel production unspoken for, and that's gonna give us or any ultimate project operator a huge degree of flexibility to use that in whatever way they see fit, whether to commit it as part of, let's say, putting together the capital stack for project finance, or not committing it at all. And so it's about getting that kind of validation from an off-taker, getting that injection of capital, but not giving them so much that you're giving away that firstborn.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe just for the sake of historical record here, I mean, I'm looking at oh man, where is it? I haven't misspelled here. Sumitomo. So you have 2-year standstill, maximum 15%, right? That they'd have to buy in the market, or I guess another private placement, presumably, right? So they cannot move further than that. So again, sort of a strengthening bit for you. They have to vote in accordance with management recommendations for shareholder votes, right? And I'm looking at now Outokumpu, same thing, right? That they only an 8-year offtake, similar sort of restrictions there, right? That if they want to maintain or preserve the right to that offtake, they have to hold their shares, right? So again, I mean, I'm saying this just again for the sake of the listeners, these very strengthening sort of clauses that you don't necessarily see this in every offtake agreement, which I think is noteworthy and kind of worthy of applause on your part and on FPX's part for managing those things. And again, feel free to respond to that in any way if you feel free, but I will just jump here to Jogmec then, right? So Japanese state agency dedicated to mineral exploration. You've signed last April 2-year program to just look for aware weight around the world. Can you just updates where you can and when you can with this process? I mean, can you explain the steps that have been taken already? Can you provide any color on this update at all? Where are you looking? Where have you looked? That sort of thing, right? Can you provide any details on this one?
Yeah. So first of all, FPX is focused on its flagship project at Baptiste on a unique style of nickel mineralization. It's not a nickel sulfide or a nickel laterite. The nickel is hosted in a nickel iron mineral called awarenite. There are occurrences of awarenite in dozens of countries around the world, but Baptiste represents the first sort of large-scale economic concentration of awarenite. So Jogmec's interest here is in finding new sources of nickel, specifically for the Japanese auto industry. And so what they do is they work with Western companies to go out to fund exploration and ultimately to joint venture projects that are uncovered via those exploration activities, for ultimately to sell them to Japanese trading houses or mining companies, as the case may be. So they are, as you mentioned, funding 100% of this program over the next, now year and a half or so, or 15 months or so. And we will have a news release in coming weeks here on the results of that work. We have a very strong team leading that, including our VP of Generative Exploration, a guy named Keith Patterson, who was formerly head of generative exploration with Eldorado Gold. Has a lot of experience working in a lot of jurisdictions around the world. This work really leverages off of previous exploration we had done around the world for other awarenite deposits, over 10 years ago now. So we have a bit of a running start into this, definitely a first mover advantage to try to find other deposits of this type. And, again, working with Jogmec and the Japanese government generally has been a huge benefit to us. And it's helped, frankly, to open some of the doors that have led to some of the other strategic engagement we've had, and whether it's Sumitomo or whether it's the Toyota Panasonic battery company that we also have made an agreement with recently.
Mm-hmm. And so, same kind of conceptual idea of partnerships, but obviously a slightly different take on this. Canadian U.S. federal funding applications. Is there any timeline or any sort of update you can provide in terms of when we might expect updates on those?
Yeah, on the U.S. side, we have been in pursuit of some funding that's available under the U.S. Department of Defense for feasibility stage critical minerals projects. To date, we have only seen award of funding to U.S.-based mineral development projects. They have not yet funded or provided a funding award to anything in Canada or Australia, even though they have said that they are willing to consider those. So, we'll see how the US DoD kind of pursues that or not, and whether Canada will truly be included. We think we'd be in a good position to get funding if that were the case. From a Canadian standpoint, we've received some federal funding under the critical mineral strategy last year, particularly in order to allow us to scale up and to demonstrate our larger scale production of battery grade nickel sulfate. And that work is ongoing, and we'll have results on that in the market here in the near term. Also, more recently, Natural Resources Canada announced the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, or CMIF. There are opportunities here for us to pursue funding there on key pieces of infrastructure, being the road and the power line. And we feel, like we're a known entity, certainly within the federal government of Canada. Feel we're going to put together some strong applications, and that may lead to additional, non-dilutive funding, which would be great for us and for the project and for the surrounding communities as well.
Mm. And so, just a quick follow-up. I believe you referenced the pilot program there that you received some grant funding from. Do you, just to clarify, when might we expect to hear about that?
Yeah, will probably be news in two different slices there, and that first slice would probably be sometime in the month of March, so within the next couple of months, I would say.
Okay. And so I'm going to switch gears now to a fresh topic here, and this in regards to First Nations concerns and then these sovereignty discussions, right? And I'll preface this by saying that I fully appreciate that these are sensitive conversations, and I don't expect you to provide material information or speak for organizations that are beyond your purview, right? So, but at the same time, obviously, from an investor's perspective, these are things that are really, very relevant and going concerns, right? So it's 4 First Nations: Tl'azt'en, Benji, Wutan, Kikuchi, and the Takla. So maybe starting more generically or generally, when you are having these ongoing negotiations and conversations, what does that process look like from the First Nations perspective? Is there a certain degree of a unified front? Is this all collectively versus individually? How much are the conversations all 4 or one-on-one? And then maybe more to the point and then more of a meaningful question is there sort of a leader of these 4 nations, or do they all carry a certain amount of weight? And I guess more in that sort of regard of questioning, right? In terms of how do they negotiate amongst themselves too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, these are all, good questions, interesting questions. In terms of the nations themselves, each nation is a distinct entity unto itself. It has its own form of governance, its own form of governance, its own traditions, and its own constituent family units. And so the views of one nation cannot be ascribed to another. Each nation speaks for itself as an independent nation. And they're recognized as such by the provincial government, the federal government. And that's why they form distinct nations, as opposed to all being part of one larger group. Now, they do have alliances among nations and many files that they have crossover on, whether it's within natural resources or health or police or other considerations that are relevant to any government type organization. It's not our place, frankly, to rank the priority order of nations that are impacted on our project. We are not, in a position to make any comments on strength of claim of one nation versus another. We for nations who identify themselves as being impacted by the project, where the provincial government acknowledges that to us as well, we are very happy to collaborate and work with each of those nations. Those nations, as I mentioned, can have varying governance structures. Some are managed or governed by an elected chief and council. Others have a combination of chief and council as well as hereditary leadership within family units. There is a mix of governance structures there. At the end of the day, we talk to as many people as possible, but at the same time, while respecting those governance structures within each of those communities.
Well, sure. I mean, why don't we let's talk about that aspect then, right? I mean, so why don't you provide a bit more detail then? What are your current engagements? What are the efforts that you have ongoing? And maybe if I was to try to make it less generic of a conversation, what are you trying to change, or what are you trying to redouble your efforts on in light of the recent developments with the Tl'azt'en?
Yeah. So again, as you mentioned, there are 4 nations who are impacted here. We have traditionally had agreements in place with 2 of those nations, one being Tl'azt'en, the other being Binche Wutan. And with respect to Takla and Yukuchi, we have ongoing dialogue with them, but we do not have agreements in place with those groups as well at this time. We've enjoyed a long history of positive relationship with both Tl'azt'en and Binche. With respect to Tl'azt'en, we became aware through the summer of 2023 that Chief and Council sent a letter to its band members and stating their opposition to the project on behalf of the nation. Chief and Council took that view or took that position and expressed it to us as well. We provided disclosures to the market at that time, discussing that and discussing our general approach to engagement. We know that large natural resource or resource projects are never going to enjoy uniform support, nor are they going to enjoy uniform opposition at any point in time. And those things can shift and change over time. We're most focused on, building up the data set, the facts around what the environmental considerations are, what the baseline of the environment looks like, what the traditional use of these lands looks like, what the key cultural values and sensitivities of this territory is. And so to that effect, we've been, undertaking cultural and environmental baseline studies for the last 2 years. That work is actually being done on our behalf by a local Indigenous-owned business that is collecting all that information. That information, once it's all been gathered, will then form the basis for us to contemplate getting into the environmental assessment process. And it's really during that environmental impact assessment process that all of the rights holders, as well as the proponent, being FPX, really have the opportunity to comment, to work through what we hope to be a really collaborative approach to project development. And we will be inviting all nations impacted by the project into that collaborative work environment to ensure the project is developed in a way that respects their rights and title and respects their views on how they would like to see the project developed, if at all. There's no guarantee that our project or any other mining project will receive the free, prior, and informed consent of local Indigenous groups. All we can do as a company is to continue to do what we've always done, which is to engage early, engage often, engage in a respectful fashion, and ensure that we really, walk the walk of that sort of partnership approach to project development. This is not, mining from 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. This is a truly modern approach where all rights holders are there at the table alongside the company. Every rights holder is invited to that. We eagerly want everyone's participation. We recognize that some will want to participate at all times. Some may come in and out of that process. We'll continue down that path, and we're confident that at the end of the day, as the data is gathered and as robust and transparent conversations are had around the project, we can get the feedback that we're looking for. We can get the engagement we're looking for, and really develop this in a joint partnership model with all of these nations.
It's interesting. There's a couple of points that I would be interested in kind of chasing rabbits with you on. I mean, I think that you spoke well there, that there is baggage with the mining industry, and especially in these communities, right? And I think that the approach that maybe in previous generations or previous iterations of this industry, where it was a rubber stamp, and then you had your consultations, and then you were done, and you put it in the back burner, you put it in the closet, and walked away. And in reality, it's an iterative process. It's a cyclical thing. It's an evergreen process of maintaining stakeholder communications and relations, right? And so maybe to serve as a dovetail here. So my understanding is that so the two nations that you do not have agreements signed with, Takla does have active mining on its land. If I'm, and correct me if I'm wrong, does the Yukich have active mining on their territory as well?
I'm not an expert on exactly which other mining projects may be within Yukuchi traditional territory, so it would be tough for me to comment on that. Takla, you are correct. They have a lot of experience with mining operations and mineral exploration and development projects within their territory.
Okay. And so just a couple more questions on this topic here, and maybe I'll just ask in terms of, I mean, obviously, Indian Act is a federal concern, but of course, the BC with unceded territory is its own issues as well. But I mean, what role, how active are the provincial and/or federal governments in these discussions with the Tl'azt'en in particular, I suppose?
Yeah, hard for us to comment on that specifically. I know that both the provincial government of BC, as part of its critical mineral strategy, which I've been on an advisory committee, helping the province to develop that strategy, as well as the federal government of Canada in its critical mineral strategy. Both, one of the common themes between the provincial and the federal strategy is certainly working towards sort of economic reconciliation and full Indigenous participation in these projects, both from an economic standpoint, but also through, their participation in the environmental assessment and permitting processes. And as part of that, I really do believe that the governments, and we're seeing that here, are willing to roll up the sleeves and get directly involved in ensuring these projects can advance in a way where all the rights holders, rights and title holders, are at the table alongside the proponent. And I do think that's appropriate. I do think that, these nations face a lot of different issues. As governments themselves, they have a lot of touch points with the federal government and with the provincial government on a number of different files, whether it's around healthcare, whether it's around policing, whether it's around other natural resources or economic matters, education, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. And so there's a real role, I think, for both the provincial and federal governments to play in being active participants in these resource development projects to ensure that nations feel as if their participation in these projects or their engagement in these projects also allows them to be heard with respect to other issues that they may have that they want to prioritize in their dialogue with government. If the government does not get involved, then there's a potential for a lack of trust, I think, between these nations and the ultimate regulators. And so I do applaud any government efforts by the province and by the federal government to really roll up their sleeves and get involved in these projects. That does not mean that they are signaling that they're going to approve the projects. It simply, acknowledges the reality that these are complicated relationships, government-to-government relationships between these nations and between both levels of government, and that it's just the right, respectful thing to do. And it certainly provides some assistance to proponents for government to roll up their sleeves and get directly involved. We've seen that be the case in the Ring of Fire in Ontario, where there's been sort of a project table formed, funded by the federal government, that ensures that all rights holders are there at the table in a working group to discuss the development of that project. And I personally think that's a great model for other important resource projects in Canada, and I certainly think we should be viewed as one of those.
Thank you. Interesting. Very, very cursive living in interesting times, I suppose, as the saying goes, right? So another question here, just on this concept of these unsigned or unfinished agreements, and it's two parts, and can you versus will you? And I think you kind of touched on this, right? That sometimes that if you talk about that good faith exercise of actually building relations, it's not strong arming your way through into a decision that you want. But can you versus will you move forward to a construction decision? Without agreement signed with the Tl'azt'en and the Yukutji?
Oh, that's really not for us to decide. It's a mutual decision between ourselves and those nations to see if they even want to have agreements with us as a company. So we're seeking agreements with those groups. We're interested in having agreements with all of the impacted nations here to provide a framework for how we can best collaborate. But that's not a decision that we make on our own as a company.
Sure. No, thank you. That fair answer. Last one here, and this is one where I'm not even going to ask any leading question. I just want to, I will just ask for you to provide any sort of detail as you can on this. But so the Tl'azt'en, there was a recent sort of release from that nation. A petition had been handed to the chief of council. Sounds like they might be potentially accelerating their election from 2025 to this coming June. And again, no leading question. Is there anything, just details or input or things that you know that maybe the market might benefit from knowing as well, based on that, or any information there?
Yeah, it's not appropriate for us to comment on the internal governance dynamics at any nation. Just can't provide any color there, and that's really all we would have to say on that.
No, that's reasonable. I just can't help but ask, right? So let's switch gears then. So BC critical mineral strategy, right? Do you mind, again, you touched on it, right? You're on the board. Can you just give a brief overview of what it is, as well as FPX's involvement in it?
Yeah, the strategy hasn't been published yet. It's still being worked on. I think the plan is to publish it at some point in the first half of this year. Exact timing is not known. I myself don't know the exact timing of its publication. The advisory committee that FPX was invited to participate in, where I was the representative, involved, members of industry. So it was us and Tech Resources as members of industry, union or labor representation, multiple different representatives representing various First Nations groups, and industry associations as well. So it was good and wide-ranging group. We had a lot of really productive dialogue around the table over several different sessions over the fall. There's a lot of opportunity for BC to pursue in the critical mineral space, as there is for many provinces across the country. For BC, there's perhaps fewer downstream opportunities than you might see in Quebec and Ontario, where you have, the proximity or the sort of the history of auto production. That's not the case here in BC. I think where the real opportunities are in BC is on the upstream side, on development of the next generation of large-scale nickel projects, copper projects, etc. I can't really be more specific yet about what is exactly going to end up in that final strategy. It's not yet been finalized, but I think it's going to set a nice framework for exactly kind of what parts of that critical mineral supply chain can BC really leverage its participation in, and there's some decision making to be made there. But a key theme of that is really using this opportunity, this sort of almost once in a century opportunity around critical minerals supply chain development, to not just create jobs, bolster the economy, but also use it as a meaningful vehicle to advance economic reconciliation with First Nations. And it's really one of those rare instances when you have an economic opportunity that both is going to be positive for the economy, can be positive for communities, and can be a net positive driver from an environmental standpoint. I can't think of any other industry that offers those opportunities, and so it'll be great to see the strategy published, and it'd be great to see significant investment by the provincial government of BC to make it all a reality.
So I just have a couple of questions left here, and I'm going to try to rephrase this, because you're right. I mean, unfinished content is not. I can't expect you to kind of give us a draft and we can disseminate on the internet. Obviously, it's not the expectation here. But could I just ask you, Martin Turenne, as the individual, and sidestepping the not asking you to put on your hat as a member of this panel or this board, but what changes? What positive changes or what growths would you like to see yourself, personally speaking, in terms of our approach to the way that we manage our mineral? So if I can just ask you on a philosophical, theoretical level, moving forward, Martin Turenne, you're president of the world for a day, right? What are some changes that you would like to see implemented?
Yeah, I think it does go back to that point I made earlier about government really rolling up its sleeve and playing an active role in facilitating and deepening engagement between industry and nations. I think there's been an approach in the past where government can kind of be a little bit sort of standoffish or sort of wash their hands of the situation and say, no, it's up to industry to go out and affect economic reconciliation with Indigenous groups. And I think that really, in so doing, the government really can abdicate its responsibility. the root cause of the need for reconciliation is historical injustices that the government of Canada, the government of BC, or really in writ large, the people of Canada, have the injustices that for which we all bear some responsibility, from which First Nations people in this country have suffered. To expect that any single company, whether it's a mining company, a pipeline company, a forestry company, or any other company, can go into a community and effect reconciliation on its own without the full participation of the government in acknowledging those wrongs and working meaningfully to try to redress them is I think naive, and it doesn't really meet I think these nations where they are, which is where they want comprehensive solutions to seeing better outcomes for their people. And that doesn't mean just a mining project in isolation or a pipeline project in isolation. It means a comprehensive approach to reconciliation. No single company can affect that on its own, but it can be part of a larger solution, working hand in hand with government to approach these nations in a respectful manner, to say, how can we potentially make economic development in your territory meaningful to you, beneficial to you, and how can we use a project like the one that FPX is advancing to unlock a whole host of benefits, whether it's employment benefits, economic development benefits, to say nothing of the opportunities to use a project like ours to improve critical habitats, to work to preserve cultural and heritage sites and activities and practices within these communities. But that has to be sort of a 360 approach, and it can't just be industry doing it all on its own.
I can't help but ask as a follow-up, you've been CEO of FPX for 8 years now. Have you seen growth? I mean, are there positive strides being made in terms of that nation-to-nation relationship, in terms of when you're on the ground up there speaking to these people in these nations? Have you seen a growth in trust or in a willingness for them to come to the table and speak with you, or how has the relationship evolved?
Yeah, these relationships, they evolve over time. You're sometimes in periods when it's incredibly positive, and you're seeing the benefits of job opportunities being created for young people, or a real collaborative approach to how to design something as simple as a drill program, and having First Nations employees. I mean, we've had in our more recent campaigns, like, well in excess of 50% of the workforce has been from the local communities. That's great to see. We've had great involvement from First Nations monitors and people who are making sure we're doing the right thing and keeping us to our promises, and keeping us to our agreed work programs and practices of how we conduct work. At the same time, there's also periods when it's a bit more difficult. No relationship. If you have a partner at home, if you've got a partner or kids or parents or family members or friends, no relationship is ever always sunshine and roses. Sometimes you go through some difficult times, and that's just life. It's just about how you conduct yourself in those more difficult periods. And our approach as a company is just to kind of maintain a steady, consistent path. I think we've always done that. We'll always continue to do that, and I think that's going to be the path that ultimately leads to success here. And when I mean success, I mean just really deep, positive engagement and collaboration. As I said, project is still at a relatively early stage. We're not yet in the environmental assessment process. We're not seeking consent for a mine. At this point, we just want people to be involved in doing their due diligence to make sure that this project, if it does go ahead, is done so in a way that meets with their needs. And we're absolutely committed to that.
You touched on the environmental assessment. Just one last little kind of very pointed question here, then I will ask you just about the philosophical kind of repricing of nickel and carbon. But does the delay of the critical mineral strategy have any risk whatsoever of delaying your entry into the EA process?
No, that the two are not tied. There's a very clear EA and permitting process in place for mining projects like ours in BC. As I said, we would hope to enter the EA process later this year, or if not, in early 2025. Before we do so, we want to ensure that we have, positive relationships in place with all the impacted nations to the greatest extent that we can, and make sure that we enter that process where there's no surprises and that there's a transparent and existing basis of communication between ourselves and all those impacted groups.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Martin. And just one last question here, and this is where I teased at the beginning, and I'll try to be concise with my lead in here. But we have this, and I speak to this as someone who I believe fully in the future of nickel and copper. I think that there's just an inevitability of our necessity, especially as Canadians, and that's why I am so much a proponent of Canadian best practice in terms of environmental regulations and labor regulations are second to none in the world. And so if we want to be mining these things, we should be mining them here, right? And right now we are stuck on the other flip side of that coin, where you have Indonesian nickel flooding the market, where I think they got this from your own literature, where your nickel 2 tons per CO2 per 1 ton of nickel versus up to 69 tons of CO2 versus to 1 ton of nickel, not to speak of the absolute just environmental destruction that occurs sometimes over there with those laterite mines, right? And the smelting process and the upgrading process, pardon me. But what has to change, right? I mean, we have these sort of, again, like these dueling tensions where right now it's just a single pricing model, and we're, that more high quality means sometimes it's more expensive, right? And you're undercut by these very cheap Indonesian nickel mines in particular, what I'm referencing. What has to change? I mean, is this a government solution? Is this a market-based solution? I mean, all of the above. I mean, how do we get to a point where you actually value, or you've monetized or managed to put a dollar value on, or an economic value on preservation of environmental standards versus degradation? I mean, can you just kind of, within that play field, can you just discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's this topic we could talk about for a long time. I'll try to just crystallize it down to one example that's relevant to FPX, and that is the investment that we got from Outokumpu last year. So Outokumpu is the largest stainless steel producer in Europe, and it used to be one of, if not the largest stainless steel producers in the world. And then the Chinese stainless steel industry kind of overtook the world and is now the dominant producer. Outokumpu continues as a company to this day, of course, and the way that they market their own stainless steel products is as being the lowest carbon stainless steel in the world. Part of the way that they were able to do that is because they relied in part on Russian nickel. Now, Russian nickel, despite all its potential ESG implications, does get produced with a very low carbon footprint. So Russian nickel feeding into European stainless steel made European stainless steel much lower carbon than Chinese stainless steel. And Outokumpu has been able to market its product as the lowest carbon stainless steel in the world, and has been able to yield preferential pricing versus the Chinese alternative from its customers. So if that is true for Outokumpu producing a stainless steel product, the same should also be true for a mining company producing a low carbon nickel commodity versus, let's say, a high carbon nickel product coming out of Indonesia. The reason that Outokumpu made an investment here is in order to get a line of sight on nickel units, in order to preserve their competitive advantage as a low carbon producer. So these things are already in evidence in other aspects of heavy industry. It's also in evidence in things like, fair trade coffee, right, which is going to trade at a higher price than non-fair trade coffee. So there are mechanisms in place already whereby market participants, through a combination of government mandates or even just market preference by consumers, are willing to pay more for responsibly produced materials. I'm confident that we will see that in nickel pricing in the years to come. I'm not sure that it's going to come in the form of like an LME contract necessarily for, a high ESG, low carbon product that trades at X and regular non-compliant, nickel trades at X minus something. But in bespoke, contractual agreements for offtake, companies like ours will be able to drive a price that's higher than the LME benchmark. I'm absolutely convinced of that. It may not be as transparent to the market. Like I say, there won't necessarily be a low carbon LME price and a high carbon LME nickel price. But I absolutely believe it will impact on the ultimate revenues to be yielded from a project like ours.
No, thank you. And you bring to mind sort of the way that they price iron, right? The 65 versus 62 and deleterious elements, all that.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of referencing that, and maybe not so much. But I think, like you say, we can. That's a whole other conversation, right? So maybe we'll put it there. We'll end it there. Final thoughts? Anything that you want to just to remark upon before we go?
Yeah, I mean, just bringing it back to the Sumitomo investment, it's obviously the most topical thing for us. It's really, being able to raise money at a 72% premium from one of the largest nickel companies in the world. The company's share price continues to trade well below the offering price. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but it presents a genuine opportunity for people to look at us. For anyone wanting to know more about the company, they can reach out to me directly. Just send me an email at ceo@fpxnickel.com. I do get all of those emails and I do reply. So don't be shy about reaching out with questions to me directly.
Mm-hmm. And Martin Turenne, you're absolutely right. Baptiste project, very, very strong project, great economics especially for a project of its size, cutting edge of environmental sustainability, very, very strong. If you're looking for nickel exposure, I think that this is a great company for you to be looking into. Martin, thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you again soon, perhaps.
Thanks again, Matt.